Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. If you're a yoga practitioner or teacher who knows that there's more to yoga than poses, but you're wondering where to find that, come join our quiet little party. Here you'll find resources to help you deepen your practice, as well as insightful conversations with yoga, movement, and meditation teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. So we talk about all things gentle yoga, meditation, yin, restorative, yoga therapy, mindfulness, and more. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today for an exploration of the mindful and the mindless. I went down this rabbit hole yesterday because I was thinking about how to define and describe what mindful movement is. We're in the middle of the mindful movement teacher training, so it's been a lot on my mind. So what does it mean to do a movement practice in a mindful way? And so I ended up thinking kind of about the inverse, like, okay, what is mindless movement? So that led me to Google mindful versus mindless, and it was interesting. So I actually found that a few of the articles that came up were promoting the idea that sometimes it's better to be mindless, which of course made me curious, like what did they mean by that? So today's episode will look at these terms, mindful versus mindless, and how they might apply to movement practice, especially for those of us doing movement practices for the purpose of developing our mindfulness skills. It's a relevant question. I will post a link in the show notes to the main article that I'm going to mention in this episode. That was kind of the inspiration for this exploration of terms. And you can always find those show notes, links, and any other resources on my website at movedtomeditate.yoga/podcast, as well as the full list of other episodes and interviews that you might enjoy. Speaking of enjoyment, if you get something valuable or interesting from listening to this podcast, please take a moment to rate it and review it on the platform of your choice. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, you go to our show's page on the app and then scroll down to the ratings and reviews, where you click See All to find the Write a Review button, where you can share a little something. I know that's like kind of a few clicks to get there. I wish they would make that just a little simpler. But the feedback really helps me to know what topics resonate with you, and it makes a huge difference in new people finding the show. So hopefully you find it fun, like I do, to share and support the things you like, and I certainly appreciate any feedback and any reviews and ratings that you leave us. So on to our topic of mindful versus mindless activity and how that applies to movement practice. So let's start with the article that took me down that rabbit hole, which was an August 2021 piece in the Scientific American called Sometimes Mindlessness is Better Than Mindfulness by Alexander Burgoyne, and apologies to the author if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but I will link to his article. I know that I could be biased because obviously I really value mindfulness, and I've practiced mindfulness meditation for so many years, but I don't think that I'm coming from a defensive place with this. It's just more of a concern that it is confusing when we use the same terms, but we're not talking about the same thing. And I actually like the spirit of the article, which seems to be about how not to overthink when you're doing a task. I just had some issues with what he labeled as mindful versus mindless. And I'm not really interested in rebutting the article, but I thought it was a good opportunity to just reflect on these terms. But here's a quote from the article to illustrate what I mean. He writes, "Although mindfulness has its merits, psychological research has also revealed that in some circumstances it's important to be mindless. That is, as we develop skill in complex tasks, we can perform them with increasing facility until attention seems to be unnecessary. Everyday examples range from riding a bike to chopping cucumbers to brushing your teeth. Underlying this state of automaticity, as cognitive psychologists call it, are mental processes that can be executed without paying attention to them. These processes run off without conscious awareness, a chain reaction of mental events. We don't perform all tasks automatically, but many can be performed this way once they are well practiced. What do you think? So for me, first off, isn't this like saying that mastery is mindlessness? Mastery of a task means it doesn't require a lot of conscious supervision to execute well. But is that really mindlessness? Like, there goes Yo-Yo Ma again, mindlessly playing Bach's cello suites. I don't think so. I don't disagree at all with the value of being efficient and developing some automaticity, but I am uncomfortable with this dichotomy that's been set up here as mindfulness versus mindlessness. Mindlessness is not the word I would use to describe my ability to do a movement or a task without overthinking it. And it's kind of a leap to say that if you have a tendency to overthink things, then the solution would be to check out and be mindless. That sounds like going from one extreme to another in my mind. To me, mindless movement or mindless yoga or Tai Chi or whatever activity would be like doing those movements but in a distracted way and not giving yourself a break from whatever you've been thinking about all day or just kind of getting lost in past and future thoughts. It could also be focusing on competing with others rather than with being present to yourself. Another way mindlessness often shows up, I think, is when we ignore signals from the body and we push through discomfort or low energy. Like, you might be going through the motions of your yoga or movement practice perfectly, but not practicing mindfulness if you are operating more on assumptions and expectations than the actual signals of the body in that moment. Another piece of this is to get clear on what we mean by mindfulness, since it seems that it's kind of being conflated with overthinking, at least by some on the internet. When we say that mindfulness means paying attention, that's not thinking about what you're doing or creating a kind of focus where you feel self-conscious or start to micromanage your experience. It's also not about getting rid of thoughts. When you're practicing mindfulness, you can notice thoughts showing up, but you learn that you don't actually have to engage with every single thought that flows through your mind. The article used an example of a study that looked at golfers and how what they paid attention to would affect their performance. So when the golfers focused too much on their swing, it got them all up in their heads and they didn't perform well. I can totally believe that. I would contend, though, that that's not really mindfulness. That's more like being vigilant, because there's an attachment to the outcome. Perfectionism and self-judgment are following right behind that kind of focus. This is why it's important to remember that mindful attention is not just paying attention, but paying attention in a non-judgmental, curious way that's present moment centered and not fixated on getting a certain outcome. It's about observing and being wholly in our present moment experience. That distinction is so important, and I can see how it would make it challenging to study mindfulness in relation to something like sports performance, because you are trying to improve and to hit certain goals. And maybe mindfulness could help with that, but probably more indirectly, because in its essence, mindfulness is not goal-oriented. So if that's not really mindfulness, then mindlessness is not the actual opposite of that outcome-driven, fixated kind of focus. I'd like to take this a little further and talk about what mindfulness actually is, because I often see mindfulness being reduced down to just a sliver of what it encompasses, which reduces its possibility to have a positive impact for people, which is unfortunate. In the Buddhist meditation traditions, mindfulness is a broader, richer term than what people often think. There are several dimensions to practicing mindfulness that are important to note. And one is that mindfulness is not just single-pointed attention or what we would call concentration or focus. Mindfulness is more like the ability to pay attention to where we're placing our attention. And I'm sure that sounds a little abstract at this moment, so let me try to give an example. In meditation, this might look like choosing an anchor, like the breath, and placing your attention on it, and then becoming aware when your mind has drifted off, so you can come back to the anchor. I said aware like that because it's the awareness of where your attention went that's the mindfulness part. The sticking with an anchor is the concentration part. So you're choosing an anchor, placing your attention on it, and then, your mind is going to drift off. When you become aware of that, that's mindfulness. Okay, so they work together, and both are useful. Concentration helps us to develop a steadier mind. Thank you. And mindfulness helps us to actually notice patterns and habits and have insights. Like when I become aware that my mind has wandered, and after it does that, like 52,000 times, I might start to notice that, it's frequently wandering to worry or planning or to another state. And there's kind of like patterns to this. So mindfulness teaches us a lot about where our attention is tending to go. And since it's not that singular focus, mindfulness can be aware of more than one thing at a time, like your whole field of experience can take in kind of the whole experience at once, because it includes all of our senses, like seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touch. And you could say that concentration is a practice of skillfully excluding, because we're trying to narrow down and eliminate distractions, while mindfulness includes, because it's more about being present to the wholeness of experience. In another style of mindfulness practice, there's another technique that's a little different to this coming back to the anchor style that I just described above, and that would be something called choiceless awareness. In the research world, when they look at this, they often call it open monitoring, so as a style of mindfulness practice. And so that's more like availability, receptivity to whatever is arising in the present moment. It's really, I think, one of the main ways that we use mindfulness in a movement practice, as a side note. But we can try it a little bit together. So if you sit back right now and just pause, you can open to the present moment. See if you can let go of expectations of what you'll notice or pay attention to, and just be aware of the next sound that arises. Let your eyes move around a little bit. And wherever your gaze lands, take in the shapes and colors or the light there. And what's the first sensation in your body that you notice? Okay, so that was different than daydreaming or being mindless, right? So mindfulness is a lot more than just paying close attention to how you do a task. It's actually much richer and more interesting than that. The idea of mindfulness being at odds with automaticity or mastery of a task kind of falls apart when we actually look at mindful movement and meditation techniques and how mindfulness is taught through these forms. We actually use easy to learn movements in order to create opportunities to develop mindfulness. So this is why parts of that article made no sense to me, because this is what's so great about a repetitive movement like a Qigong flow, where it's really easy to learn the mechanics. It's not physically demanding, and once we've got it, we can just drop in to a state of receptive awareness through the movement. That's the joy of it. It stops being about which direction I'm moving which hand and how far do I reach and how do I shift my balance. I kind of have to let go of all of that in order to experience the mindfulness in motion. Simplicity in a mindful movement practice is a great opportunity to shift your attention away from the basic mechanics of doing the movement to perhaps something else, like checking in with your mood or your energy level or your thought patterns. or just enjoying the embodied feeling of the movement in open awareness. And also breath meditation. When we do a breath meditation, we're not using the breath as a meditation anchor because we're learning how to do the task of breathing, right? By the time we're old enough to meditate, I think we've achieved some degree of automaticity on that. We're using the breath as an anchor for meditation because it's happening in the present moment. Mindfulness is not about learning the skill of breathing. It's not always about a task that we're performing. It's more about learning to bring fresh attention and curiosity to a very familiar activity like breathing. So we learn how not to go through life on autopilot. So I'm sorry, I can't end the episode by telling you to go off and be mindless. I hope it's been useful, though, to unpack these terms and to explore a fuller description of what mindfulness practice includes. There are a lot of ways to practice mindfulness, and it's not really about overthinking your experience, getting into a self-conscious headspace, or playing into perfectionism. In fact, I think it can help us unwind some of those patterns, but we need good information and good instruction so that we really know how to practice. I would love to know how this topic resonated with you, so feel free to reach out with any comments or questions. You can always find me at movedtomeditate.yoga, which is my website. And thanks again for listening and for being curious about the mind and the body and these topics and how to show up in your life. Be well until next time. So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find us that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, live online classes, teacher trainings, and private lessons, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. Thanks so much for listening.